Yeah, the poor man didn't really believe me, but he was still left speechless. Whether he believes me or not, a seed of doubt has been planted. I'm sure he'll know what to do with it, said Claire with a mirthless laugh. Do you really hate me that much? Hate the kids that much? Asked Jessica plaintively. Hate you? Asked Claire, surprised at the question. Not anymore. I used to. And I definitely don't hate your children. But for years I carried an immense hatred of you. I used that hate to warm me when I was cold, to feed me when I was hungry, to keep me alive when I should have died. I used it to push past the worst parts of those years. It drove me, relentlessly. It motivated me to accomplish so many things, to do things I would have never dreamed of, and thus to succeed beyond my wildest dreams. But I'm not sure when. A few years ago, I guess, I came to realize the hate had dissipated. Jessica looked at her sister and saw a frigidness in her hazel eyes that hadn't been there before. She shivered. The tremor traveled along her spine, down her legs and to her toes. The sensation left her feet slightly numb and tingling. With that said, I'm furious at you. If you had just left your gigolo out of our conversations, I wouldn't have ever said anything. Just the mention of his name sends me back to those horrible moments in the past, and it maddens me thinking about it. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I'm sorry. I began Jessica hesitatingly, lamely, in apology. Save it for the priest, sister. There's nothing you can say that will undo what you've done to me and, yes, to Malcolm too. He's a blind, foolish man. But he's a man who mistakenly worshipped the very seat you're stinking but sat on. So, I feel sorry for him. He was taken in by your lies and deceit, just as our parents were. I hated them, too, as I did Malcolm. Now, I don't hate anyone. I have my life, and it's a better life than most. Scooting her chair back, Claire stood abruptly, saying with an air of finality, "Lunch is on me." Jessica, unable to look at her sister, stared at her food, now grown cold, nodded in acknowledgement. Claire moved to stand behind Jessica, then bent down near her sister's ear and said softly, almost in a whisper, "I didn't cause the problems, I only brought them to light. Where it goes from here is up to you and Malcolm. I'm leaving tonight and I won't be returning. So, this is not au revoir but adieu." Jessica, overcome by a range of warring emotions, couldn't bring herself to face her sister or even voice a response to her departure. She was angry, very angry, at what Claire had done, but also, in a barely perceptible way, she understood that her own actions had precipitated the outcome. As the minutes dragged by, she wept silently, while her rambling thoughts tried to line up to form some sense of coherency. Until, unexpectedly, an instant knowing leaped out and Jessica became astutely aware of what she had to do. "You want what?" bellowed Malcolm, at the person that was once the love of his life. "I said, I want a divorce." "I know it's not what you want, but," started Jessica as she faced off with her husband, red-faced and shaking with a magnificent anger, like a giant sequoia tree caught in the middle of an earthquake. Malcolm forced himself to a calmer emotional state as Jessica spoke. "You don't know what I want. You haven't known what I've wanted in a long time, because I've come to realize you don't know me," responded Malcolm, at a volume just below that of a roar, interrupting his wife. "By the same token, I don't know you anymore. I thought I did, but it looks like I was way off base. Please, Malcolm, if you love me, please," begged Jessica, before being cut off again. "Love you? You have got to be kidding me. After what you've done, it's a wonder I don't hate you more than I do. I've never loved, and could never love, a bitch. That's what you are, Jessica, a goddamn bitch." "Malcolm, how can you say that?" "I'm the MO, cried out Jessica in shock, the pain evident in her voice. "Listen, you bitch, I'll decide what I want to do. Not you, got it? If I want a divorce, then I'll get one. If I want to stay married and make your life a living hell, well, I'll do that. If you try to fight whatever I decide, I'll bring down a ton of shit on you and your lover." "But Malcolm," she started to say, then she noticed his eyes. They were filled with a raw, unyielding hatred. There was anguish, too, along with a mix of other emotions, but the brightest of them was the hatred. It gleamed in his eyes, causing them to glisten with a flickering heat that caused her heart to feel an indistinct but choking discomfort. She shifted her gaze to include his face and saw it was deeply lined, hard-bitten, with an unrelenting grimness, and she knew. Malcolm was not just mouthing words. He meant every syllable he uttered. A vague remembrance crossed her mind, of another place and another time. The memory quickly gained a strange and swirling solidity. She'd been with her sister. They'd been with two boys. Boys? Two young men. Yes, that fit better. She had been kissing him, and he'd been running his hands over her blue jean-covered hips when out of the brush burst an enraged Malcolm. What in the bloody hell? Goddamn you. You bitch. And you. You sorry pig. I don't know who you are, but I'm going to tear your goddamn balls off and feed it to the fish. Then, as even now, those words seared her mind. She heard the great fury and the infinite depth of pain in his cry. She knew, before she turned in surprise to look at her husband, what she would see. He was charging at them. Before Jessica could throw herself clear, he barreled into both of them. Something hard hit the side of her head. She was knocked to the ground. Although she hadn't lost consciousness, she'd been severely stunned. She'd fallen facing the creek, but out of her peripheral vision she saw motion. She tried moving, but it was as if her body was paralyzed. All she could do was to stare at the quickly shuffling feet of her husband, as she heard grunt after grunt, punctuated by meaty impacts and some yelling and shouting. Then she saw Malcolm dragging a seemingly lifeless body into the creek where he dunked the inert body's head several times beneath the flowing water, until he let go. It was Ian. Ian. A low moan of sorrow escaped her lips as she saw Ian's body floating limply, moved about by the steady push of the gurgling flowing water. Malcolm walked slowly toward her, until his shoes stopped right before her eyes. She felt herself being lifted, and a seesaw of motion passed across her vision, until he had firmly settled her into his arms. "Oh my God, Malcolm, you've killed him!" cried out a voice filled with disbelief and horror. It was Claire's voice. She heard various sounds, splashing, cursing, puffs of breath from a great effort. But inexorably she was carried away from them and Ian. Then blessed darkness descended, and she succumbed to its call. For some reason Jessica had forgotten the particular details of that day. In the days after, in the time she spent recovering, she'd buried the memory deep, and although she sometimes felt a niggling tickle of its presence, it never came to fruition until this very moment, as she stared at Malcolm's set face. Ian, who'd been saved in the nick of time by Claire's and Ian's friend actions, had been taken to the same hospital as Jessica, but fear had kept them from trying to contact each other. Although the police investigated, Malcolm's name had never been mentioned. If it had been and the true facts of the incident had been revealed, Jessica and Ian would have been the ones run out of town by her family. So by sheer coincidence, both Jessica and Ian explained it was a swimming accident. Despite their stories not matching completely, the police believed them. It was because their stories, due to the difference in the details, were expected with such a traumatic experience. After Jessica had been released from the hospital, a silent Malcolm had come to get her and then drove them to her parents' home. Malcolm told her dad he was done with her, that she was her parents' concern. Once more, Jessica had blatantly lied. She blamed her sister for the entire thing, and even hinted at being served drink upon drink until she'd become delirious by the alcohol and pliant to the deliberations of Ian, aided and abetted by Claire. It took some doing and a lot of pleading, with her parents acting as mediators, but Malcolm eventually agreed to take her back. It took even longer, years, before he forgave her and for their relationship to resume its former course. It took even longer before Jessica began listening to Ian, hooking up with him, once again. Naturally, Ian, in spite of his fear of Malcolm, wanted to get back at him in any way he could, for the drumming and near-drowning Malcolm had given him. What better way to get even than to screw the man's wife, and better yet, get her pregnant. And not once, but twice. And all done without Malcolm's knowledge. For Jessica, all this happened over a period of time. Enough time to adjust to it and even become comfortable with it. Then Claire returned, entered the picture and upturned everything. Now, as she faced the man she once loved, the entirety of her deceptions and long-held secrets came rushing to her all at once. The shame, the guilt, the regret, they all filled her, nearly overwhelming her, and she knew she couldn't continue to live with her husband, not and live with the deception, too. Jessica looked away from Malcolm, unable to hold his piercing gaze any longer. He knew of some of her deceptions already, but something else in his eyes seemed to penetrate deep into her. She was frightened he would see everything else if she continued to meet his gaze. "Okay, Malcolm, I'll await your decision. I'll leave it up to you, whatever you want to do. I'll go with whatever it is," mumbled the dispirited Jessica. After an expectant moment, Malcolm responded, "What? I'm getting old and my hearing isn't as good anymore. What did you say?" A flash of anger passed through Jessica. Malcolm was playing with her. His hearing was better than ever. But she had no choice but to go along with it. She feared this was but the beginning of a long and dangerous game. If nothing else, change was coming, a change that Jessica had never truly foreseen, a change that she'd never expected, but was now hurtling toward her at a blinding speed. "I'll go with whatever you decide." "Okay," said Jessica in a louder, but fraught voice. Nodding, Malcolm raised his arm and pointed at the door with his finger, saying rather calmly, "Get out, I'll let you." "What?" "I need some things, Malcolm. My clothes, my makeup. Please, I need my," exclaimed a startled Jessica. "I don't care. Leave. Now. I'll call you when I decide what I'm going to do," said Malcolm in a voice colder than an Arctic blast. "Someone else can get your things later and take them to you." Jessica knew she wasn't going to get anywhere with Malcolm. She could force herself past him, but in the state he was in, he just might lose control and hurt her. Or worse. Well, thank Claire and your own stupidity for getting you into this mess. And damn that Ian. His brand of stupidity was of a special kind. No common sense. Only, you went along with everything he said, didn't you? So really, how stupid does that make you, in comparison? Thought Jessica to herself. Reluctant, but resigned to the situation, Jessica sighed, and a slight tremble vibrated her body in agitated response at giving in to Malcolm's demand. But without any further words, she turned and walked out of the house she'd lived in for over 24 years. As she drove off, in her rear-view mirror, she caught a glimpse of Malcolm's motionless figure, set like a large silhouetted statue, in front of one of the windows. For whatever reason, that image reminded her of an old movie she and Malcolm had watched years ago, The Exterminating Angel, where several dinner guests were trapped inside the house by a quirk of their own minds. Somewhat fearfully, Jessica wondered, who was the one trapped, she or Malcolm? Malcolm watched her leave, and the immense pain that constantly filled him now stepped up a notch, and an almost physical ache hit him in the pit of his stomach, causing him to grunt in reflex. "Goddamn you, Jessica. You 304, you lying shit, cheap filthy street hooker," shouted Malcolm to no one in particular. He had to vent somehow, or else he would burst and his mind would flow out like water from a broken dam. He knew he'd utterly lose it then. He stepped slowly away from the window, his face set with grim determination. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to find out who Jessica has been seeing and whatever else is going on. And I'm going to hopefully prove Claire wrong," promised Malcolm to himself. With that plan of action established, Malcolm went to bed. Although his sleep was fitful in the morning, he was sure Jessica's sleep was even more lacking than his. And that belief comforted his tortured mind a little, enough for a slight, if foreboding, smile to crease his face. The days following the night his wife left the house were filled with a thick, blurry, shifting fog. Malcolm went to work, often staying late, even beyond the hours of his business partner, Eric. He ate, he shit, he slept. He performed each task and every action adequately enough, but it was as if he were a robot. He was on autopilot. He remembered very little of the mundane activity of each day. In fact, he felt no particular emotion other than that of the determination for the plan he put into play. So when he wasn't at work, he did those things necessary to carry out his plan. Then one day, he had the first of many answers. Several days after he'd thrown Jessica out, Malcolm's doorbell rang. It was his daughter, Trisha. "Hi, Trish, come to see your old man," greeted Malcolm with a warm smile. It was the first such smile to grace his face in many days. Entering and walking past him, Trisha said, without any preamble, "I've come to get some of Mom's things." Her greeting was both curt and accusatory. Taken slightly aback by her abrupt manner, but still smiling, Malcolm said, "Okay, I've packed some of her things. I'll help you carry. I've got it. Mom gave me a list of what she wants." And with that stated, Malcolm's 19-year-old daughter went off to gather whatever she'd come to get. Trisha was normally a gregarious and blithe young woman. Her present attitude disturbed Malcolm greatly, but he knew that she must be under extreme stress now knowing that her parents were separated. Shrugging it off, he let his smile slip back from where it had come from, before Malcolm went back into the kitchen to finish his lunch. As he chewed the last bite, Malcolm was reflecting on the past, when Trisha swept into the kitchen at the hectic speed only the young can endure, stopped to stand before his seated form, with arms akimbo and wrapped in her own brand of fury, cried out, "How could you, Dad?" Caught by surprise at her question and the vehemence behind it, Malcolm uttered the only thing that came to mind. "Huh. How could you throw Mom out of her home?" cried Trish, with tears beginning to streak down her face. Standing and picking up the used dishes, he walked to the sink. He was buying time, more so than to wash the dishes. He didn't know how to answer his daughter's question without explaining in detail. He knew Trisha would never be satisfied with the ambiguous answer. She would continue to question everything, pursuing it until she was satisfied with the explanation. She was in some regards very much like him. Yet, Malcolm wasn't ready to open up, especially with any degree of detail, not until he knew, with an unshakable certainty, all the facts, which he was presently in the process of acquiring. "Answer me, Dad," demanded a weepy, but thoroughly pissed off young woman. Then, in nearly the same moment, a sudden gasp escaped Trisha and she asked in disbelief, "Are you cheating on Mom?" With his back to his daughter, he almost snorted with ironic amusement. Instead, he shook his head in answer. He looked up from the plate he was scrubbing and peered out the window above the sink. His gaze settled on the large yard behind the house. A momentary flash of memory unexpectedly filled his mind. It was just a backyard, and the swing set and the other children's play conveniences that once filled it were now long gone. But his memory overlay what his eyes saw. 2 young children running about, screaming their joy and excitement as they played. Their mother stood watchfully by as she watered the bed of flowers that she put so much care tending to. As quickly as the memory came, it just as abruptly disappeared back into the deep recesses of his nearly forgotten memories. Still, his ears continued to echo the happy sounds of his children enjoying themselves. "Trisha, why don't you sit down while I finish the dishes, then I'll try to explain." "No, now, Daddy." "Trisha," growled Malcolm in irritation at her uncompromising attitude. Trisha was smart enough to know how far to push things with her dad, and she just pushed as far as she dare go. So like an obedient daughter, Trisha clamped her mouth shut, pulled out a chair and sat. She wasn't happy, far from it, but there wasn't much she could do about it. In a couple of minutes, Malcolm joined her. "Care for something to drink?" "I have," opened Malcolm amicably. "No, thanks. I just want to know why you threw Mom out." Taking a breath and sighing, Malcolm wiped a hand down his face before replying. "What did your mother say happened?" asked Malcolm, his voice carefully controlled. Trisha shook her head, bitterly saying, "She didn't. She said you kicked her out. That's all she would say. I asked her to tell me, but she just cried and said to ask you. So I'm asking, what happened that made you throw Mom out of y'all's home?" Malcolm looked at his daughter and saw just how much she looked like Jessica when she was her age. The comparison brought a pang of pain to his heart, which in turn hardened him further. "Your mother has done grievous things, that I can't and won't accept. Because of those actions, your mother's and my relationship has been adversely affected. I don't want to discuss the details, so don't ask me for the specifics." Trisha heard her father's words of explanation. They were expressed in a monotone voice, almost droning in its presentation. Yet, she knew her father well enough to hear the pain that was hidden behind each word. Still, for the life of her, Trisha couldn't believe that her mother would so deeply hurt the man she claimed to love. "Mom wouldn't do anything to hurt you, Dad." "I know Mom. She's stubborn and argumentative, but she isn't mean and callous. Maybe your skin is a little thinner than you think and you took whatever she said the wrong way," said Trisha, hopefully. "No, Trisha, whether your mother's intent was to hurt me or not, she still committed acts that have no place in a good marriage. Some men, some women, might be able to overlook the indulgences of their spouses, but I can't." Malcolm gave a tight-lipped smile to his daughter to help take the sting out of his last words, as they were stated bleakly, but firmly. Turning his smile into a more pleasant one, he asked, "Did you get what you came?" Suddenly wide-eyed, Trisha stood up actually. She shot up from the table, the chair skidding a couple of feet back by the hard and sudden contact with the back of her straightening legs. "You and Mom are getting a divorce?" Malcolm's strained silence was all Trisha needed in answer. "No, Daddy, you can't divorce Mom. She loves you, and you love her. Please, Daddy, don't do this," pled Trisha as she burst into tears of sorrow. Malcolm hung his head a moment, listening to his daughter's quiet sobs, then stood and calmly walked over to his daughter, where he brought her into his arms, cupping her head against his chest. "It's okay, T. You go ahead and cry. Remember, no matter what happens with me and your mother, I'll always love you. And she will too." He'd started calling her T when she was still just a tyke. It was at her request, since Trisha had had trouble pronouncing her own name early on, and that's what she referred to herself as, T. Malcolm had quickly grown used to it and became his term of endearment for his daughter. However, Jessica despised the nickname, complaining it wasn't a proper name for any girl, let alone her daughter. It wasn't until Trisha had turned 14 and entered high school when she asked Malcolm to stop calling her T. because it was embarrassing to be called that in front of her friends. Saddened by his daughter's request, as he knew, the closeness and camaraderie they thus shared had come to an end. Nevertheless, Malcolm stopped calling her by that nickname. Until now. After a few minutes, her sobs quieted down and she pulled away from Malcolm. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to act the waterfall, but you caught me unexpectedly. I mean, really, I'm a grown woman. I attend a university and I live on my own. If you and Mom get divorced, it really shouldn't affect me. Not like this, anyway." With a slightly amused grin at the mention of his daughter's proclamation of, "I'm a grown woman," Malcolm quietly said, more to himself than to Trisha, "It's okay. I didn't expect it either. Stuff happens, and often, it's stuff we don't like, but all we can do is move forward." He gave his daughter one last hug before releasing her. "Are you going to be okay now?" Trisha nodded as she swiped her face of tears. She grabbed a paper towel and moved to the sink to finish removing whatever vestige remained of her sorrow. Helpless to further comfort his daughter, he sighed in frustration before saying, somewhat cheerfully, "Okay, then I'll help you pack and carry whatever it is your mom told you to get. Come on, let's do this and I'll take you out to eat, Trisha." "All right. Okay, Daddy. I'm okay now, and you can call me T if you want. I kinda like it, but only if you get me AM and M sundae for dessert." Chuckling in amusement at her demand, Malcolm said, "Okay, T, you got yourself a deal." Mona was one of the kindest, most considerate and caring of ladies. She'd married young, at 16, to an older man named Roy Leonard, who was all of 4 years her senior, which, considering her age at the time, was definitely an older man. Despite some rough issues, in particular money problems, their marriage succeeded where others failed. Mona was also a shrewd judge of character, and she made it known to Roy, early on in her marriage, that she wouldn't put up with any hijinks or tomfoolery. Roy was going to be a proper husband and a good father to their children. That was one reason they stayed together. Also, Roy, despite his questionable character in other ways, loved his wife dearly and would never do anything to hurt her. Mona never forgot the troubles she and her husband had gone through, and it tempered her judgment regarding others. So, when Jessica was thrown out by Malcolm, as soon as Mona heard about it, she rushed over to help comfort Jess. By then, Jessica was staying at her parents' old home, along with her son and his 2 roommates. Neither of the 2 roommates protested Jackson's mother living with them. First off, she was a great cook, and secondly, she was a looker. Even as a mature woman, she retained her beauty and shapely female form, which, to some degree, embarrassed Jackson, especially when his roommates drooled all over themselves when speaking of his mother as a hot babe. 2 weeks had come and gone, and Trisha had come by the day before and dropped off her mother's things. Although Trisha was just as amicable as before, Jessica had sensed a distinct change in her. It was the little things that gave it away. A slight hesitation here, where there shouldn't have been. A contemplative look, and when caught, Trisha's expression changed to a somewhat shameful look. Yes, it was the little things that gave Jessica the first hints of trouble with her daughter. Today was the 3rd day in a row that Mona had come to visit, and Jessica was getting a bit weary of her visits. "So, Jessica Ann, how are you today? I brought over some dumplings for you. I remembered how much you've enjoyed them in the past." Setting the Tupperware-like container on the table, Mona immediately jumped on her favorite subject, bingo. "I'm telling you, girl, the winnings at some of those parlors are pretty large. Why, some even get up to $1,000. Not bad for about 2 hours of blotting ink on a small piece of cheap paper. I would like for you to join me one night. I think you'd have loads of fun." More fun than Mona cast a glance around the room, stopping to gaze intently at a couple of walls, as if she had X-ray vision and could see the mess in the rooms on the other side. "Then staying here all night. I'm sure the boys enjoy visiting with you. But say, I got an idea. How about this? This Thursday you come with me to a game. They're having a triple game. If you happen to win all 3 games, the grand prize is a cruise for 2 to the Bahamas. Isn't that wonderful?" Jessica wasn't sure how to reply. She didn't want to play bingo, but neither did she want to hurt Mona's feelings. Just then, Jackson came in through the front door. Mom, where are—" "Oh, there you are," shouted Jackson, as the door's return spring slammed it shut with a loud, crisp bang. "Hi, Mrs. Leonard." "Hello, Jackson. I swear you're getting to look more and more like your father every day." Thanks, Mrs. Leonard." Turning quickly to his mother, hoping to avoid any more of Mrs. Leonard's awkward comments, Jackson said rapid-fire, "Mom, I know this is short notice, but I forgot that we're having a bake sale for a club at the university this Friday. Do you think you can whip up a couple of cakes on Thursday?" Jessica had been caught by surprise at Mona's offhanded compliment of Jackson, and suspicious thoughts quickly filled her head. What did she mean by that? Did Malcolm know that children weren't his? And had he told Roy and Mona about that? Was Mona playing some sort of sick, twisted mental game? Then her son's request penetrated directly into her dark place. Jessica quickly jumped at the chance to beg off going to bingo. Sure, Jackson. Oh, wait, Jessica replied, before turning to Mona and smiling. I'm sorry, Mona. I'd like to go with you, but family comes first, you know. Maybe some other time? Mona was looking forward to Jessica joining her for bingo, but she understood perfectly about family. Of course. Don't you worry, dear. There'll be plenty of other chances to get together. Thank you so much for understanding, Mona, said a truly grateful Jessica, although her gratitude was for another reason than for what Mona assumed, as she rose from the chair. Not at all, my dear. Taking her cue, Mona stood as well. I must be going. Roy will be home soon, and if dinner isn't on the table when he arrives, he turns into a real growly bear. Chuckled Mona at her own brand of levity. You know men. They get bigger, they get older, but they still get cranky as a baby if they aren't fed, burped, and changed. After Mona left, Jessica's thoughts returned to questioning just how much Mona knew and whether she was playing a mind game with her. It seemed everything Mona uttered was indirectly addressing Jessica's marital situation and the cause of its problems. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, thought Jessica, as she prepared dinner for her son and his roommates. Maybe I'm feeling some guilt, just a little, and that's playing tricks on me. Maybe not. Ian Wilson was not a very patient man. His burning desire for revenge had consumed his every waking moment, and even some of his sleeping moments. He had fantasized and dreamt of this very thing coming to pass. It was all he could do to hold himself in check, so many times. So, it was with a sigh of vast satisfaction that he heard of Malcolm's discovery of his wife's affair with him. He was delirious with joy. The years of pain and humiliation were tempered by the pursuit and conquest of one Jessica and Harris, not to say the least, but convincing her to have his children was a stroke of genius to his twisted sense of vengeance. Not that he cared for his children, or anyone else's children. It had simply been another opportunity to further his cause. He felt he had truly screwed over Malcolm Harris. But no, he wasn't finished with him yet. There was one more thing to do. Hi, Jessica. How are you? Asked Ian with false sincerity. As soon as Jessica answered her phone, he'd called her to ensure that she was still his, that she was still aboard, and more importantly, that she hadn't grown doubts as to his own false feelings of her. Hello, baby. I'm fine. How are you doing? Replied a beaming Jessica. Lonely. I've been waiting on you. I haven't heard from you in days. Is everything okay? Asked Ian cautiously. Yes, honey, everything is fine. And I miss you too. I wish I was there right now and in your arms. I would have called you, but it's been a bit hectic. Plus, I thought it best to let Malcolm cool down. Also, I don't want anyone to know about us until I'm divorced. I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea and assume I'm a 304. So, I'm keeping it low-key for now. Oh, but you're a bitch of the highest order, my dear Jessica. You just don't know it yet. But you will, and so will everyone else. Coldly thought Malcolm at her words, wishing he could say outright what he was thinking. Instead, Ian cooed soothingly, Shoo, I understand, baby. You don't have to explain. Ian heard a loud breath whoosh into the phone. Then, oh, baby. You always know the right thing to say at the right time. I love you so much. I wish, oh, how I wish I'd met you first. Me too, baby. Agreed Ian in a gentle but yearning tone. Then, more firmly, he said, but it is what it is. All we can do is play the hand we're dealt. Anyway, soon, you and I will be together. Nothing will matter after that. The conversation turned into phone sex, and next several minutes, Ian hears nothing but loud gasps and low moans. He lets out a few appropriate sounds, just in case she's listening as well. Not that he thinks she is, but he's come too far to bungle it now by carelessness. Are you there, baby? Asks Jessica, still breathless. Yes, babe. I'm here. That was just so, began Ian before Jessica interrupted him and finished his sentence. Incredibly awesome. Forcing a chuckle, Ian agreed. Yes, baby. It was. But, in person, it's a lot better. Way better. I know, and oh, damn. I have to go. Ian. I love you. I'll call you soon. A mirthless smile spread across Ian's face as he disconnected the call. Things are going so well. It took years to get to this point, but the outcome will be well worth it, he thought laughingly. It's time to set in motion the last part of my plan, and I'll do it this Saturday. Then, Malcolm will know what it is to have wasted nearly 30 years of his life. To know his wife is an easy 304, and that his marriage is nothing but a sham. To know the children he raised aren't his, and to know just how true his good friends really are. It'll gut him. Buoyed by these exultant thoughts, Ian Wilson laughs gleefully as he slowly limps to his bedroom, where he sleeps the slumber of the victorious. Malcolm sat and carefully studied the paperwork he held between his hands, then reread the report that had accompanied the lab results. Nothing had changed since the last time he read it. The results were the same. He paid the fee for the DNA testing, and 2 weeks later, he held the ever-conclusive results in his hands. It had been easy enough to collect a genetic sampling of his children. Trisha, on her visits, still used the hairbrush she'd left in her old room, and Jackson stopped by every now and then to change his clothing and eat. He'd also sent a hair sample off of one of Jessica's hairbrushes. Jessica was definitely the mother of Trisha and Jackson. Malcolm wasn't sure what he was supposed to feel now. He hadn't really believed Claire's assertions, but they'd caused such a itch that he just had to scratch. He'd more or less had the testing done to prove her wrong, not to prove Claire right. He'd been angry before, but now, despite a grim satisfaction, Malcolm angrier than ever, furious actually, at Jessica, at her running around, at her lies over the years, at everything else that he could direct at her, which, in his estimation, was quite a lot. Did he love her? He had at one time, but as things had gotten worse and worse between them, his love for his wife had also suffered. Now, he was pretty sure that whatever love he might yet feel for Jessica was so minimal that it didn't register on any scale. Was he hurt by her betrayal and her lies? Yeah, he felt the pain with every beat of his heart. His stomach still clenched up in knots at those times his mind strayed and brought up the better moments of their past. Then he thought of what else the past held, and his mind would come to an abrupt halt, and his next thoughts were filled with rage at the decades-long deception that Jessica and her lover had wrought upon him. Malcolm was not a man to take any wrong laying down, especially this most despicable of betrayals. So he vowed to find out who Jessica's lover is and confront him in the only way that Malcolm knew how to. It wouldn't be politically correct, it wouldn't be very civilized, and it would probably land him jail, possibly prison, but it was better to be a man, locked up, than to be a at-large cucked man. He still wasn't sure how he would deal with Jessica, but he knew a divorce was in the works. There was no doubt about that. Figuring that the kids would eventually come to know about their mother's affair, and their own history connected to that affair, he was going to, at the very least, publicly drag her through the mud until her skin came off and the mud replaced it. Such action wasn't very satisfying. It was far less than she'd done to him, but short of trussing her up and torturing her every day for the next 30 years, it was the best he could do, at least for now. He'd deal with any of their mutual friends that aided in covering up Jessica's cheating another time, when they least expected it. Jackson? Hi, Dad. What's up? Answered Jackson, as he held the phone to his ear while trying to eat a very large, well-stuffed burrito. I left some paperwork at home. Could you get over there and fax them to me? I'm out of town at a meeting, and I'll need those reports in about an hour. I'll text you the fax number. Can you do that? Asked Malcolm, hoping his son wouldn't say yes and forget it immediately upon hanging up. Yeah, sure, Dad. It's on my desk. It's titled, A Study of Advanced Injection Molding for Increased Production. Don't worry, I'll text the title as well. How soon can you get to the house? Okay, I'll, leave in about, 20 minutes, so figure 40 minutes. Is that okay? Answered Jackson as he began devouring the first of 3 burritos. Yeah, that'll work. I'll text you the information as soon as we hang up. Okay, Dad. Bye. 5 minutes later, Jackson's mobile phone chortled a tone, indicating he'd received a text message. But he was too busy starting on the second burrito to pay his phone any attention. Once his hunger was sated, Jackson wandered into the living room to sit in the fairly comfortable overstuffed armchair and turned on the television to see if any of his favorite shows were being rerun. Several minutes later, during a commercial about computers, he was suddenly reminded of his dad's request. Glancing at his watch, he noticed it had been 45 minutes since his dad had called. Oh shit. Jackson knew his dad was going to be pissed, but Dad had always said, better late than never. Hoping his dad would understand and live by his sage philosophy, Jackson ran out the door and to his car. Driving like a madman, which to most young adults his age, was the normal mode of driving, he arrived at his dad's place in half the time it would have, otherwise, taken. Somewhat proud of himself for some of the lost time he'd made up, Jackson rushed up to one of the gate columns, punching in the code to unlock the gate. As soon as the gate opened, Jackson ran into the house while reading his dad's text message. Where did Dad say the paperwork was? In his desk? On his desk? I guess I'll have to look for it. Rummaging through some papers atop the desk, Jackson found what his dad wanted. But he also found something else. As he glanced over this other paperwork, his eyes widened in surprise. After another moment, Jackson shook his head in dumbfounded confusion and refocused on faxing the paperwork to his dad. Yet, as he stood there, dialing the fax number and running each sheet through the scanner, his mind returned to what he'd read on the other paperwork. He could feel a slow anger beginning to burn in his mind. Later that evening, as Malcolm walked into his home, a very upset son confronted a very tired father. Waving around some papers, like a madman, Jackson stopped his rapid pacing and faced Malcolm. Why didn't you tell me before? Why did I have to read it off some stupid paper? Does Trish know? Watch your language, boy, admonished Malcolm in a gruff voice, waiting expectantly for Jackson to apologize. Sorry, Dad. But, waving his son to silence, Malcolm plopped down on the couch. Raising his eyes to meet his son's, he said, You weren't supposed to know anything about that. A stern look silenced his son, who was ready to argue the merits of what he was supposed to know and not know. I didn't tell you because I wasn't ready to discuss it with you, or Trisha. I haven't made up my mind on a few things, and until I do, this topic is closed. Before he'd finished his last sentence, Malcolm had risen and began heading to the stairs. Dad, wait, I'm not done, said Jackson loudly, to his father's retreating back. Jackson, you can bellyache all you want, but I have nothing else to say. I'm going to bed. You can spend the night, or go home. Either way, lock up. Will you? Thank you. Good night. Frustrated at his father's stubbornness and angry at the situation, Jackson walked quickly out the front door, slamming it before locking it with his key. He knew his father well enough that any further attempt at questioning him would simply piss him off. As Malcolm trudged up the last flight of stairs, he heard the door slam and gave an exasperated sigh. He understood the boy's feelings, but that didn't excuse his behavior, and until he could decide how he wanted to handle things in the near future, he was not going to discuss any of that business. Now, if his wife wanted to discuss it with her son and daughter, then that was a bit different. By all means, she should do so. Imagining the reaction she'd get, a cruel smile stretched his face for a brief moment before his face dropped back into its stoic neutrality. Jessica was humming contentedly as she prepared lunch for herself. Earlier that day, she'd once again, of a countless multitude of times, been with Ian. Handsome Ian, strong Ian, rich Ian, loving Ian, hard Ian, or so she once thought. One of the things that marred their time together was his slow gait, caused by whatever injury caused him to limp. It took him an exceedingly lengthy time to get around, especially in his spacious condo. Jessica had been ready at the gate and had wanted Ian to have sex with her as soon as she walked in through his door. Ian was usually easygoing, but when it came to sex, there was only one place to do it: in his bedroom, on his bed. Naturally, Jessica, over the years, had tried to instigate sex in various locations and on different furnishings in his condo, but Ian had remained adamant. Still, as Jessica waited for his slow arrival, she urged him to quicken his pace through gentle teasing and ever-escalating promises of sexual ecstasy. Despite her cajoling, Ian took his sweet time, limping into the bedroom, while an already unclothed Jessica awaited him. Early on in their relationship, Jessica had asked him about his limp. However, Ian had been elusive with his reply. It's something that happened a long time ago, before I met you. All the doctors said was that there is severe nerve damage along with an irreversible ligament injury. There's nothing to be done about it. End of story, Ian explained curtly. Smarting from Ian's snippy answer, Jessica responded with heavy sarcasm, Well, I didn't know. Excuse me for asking. Since then, she brought it up from time to time, and this afternoon, she'd asked once more about the history of his injury. I'm not going to discuss it, so stop asking. Okay, what is it with you? You've been harping about it for years, and you still don't get it. I don't want to discuss it. Jessica was fuming. She had become tired of Ian's off and on, cold and hot attitude, despite its infrequency. Although, more occasionally, Ian would feel distant to her. Of late, his ambivalence had become more severe and more frequent. If Malcolm hadn't found out about her and Ian, well, Jessica wasn't sure what would have happened. But she liked to think that she would have ended the years-long affair and thrown herself into her marriage, making up for all the years she hadn't been solely Malcolm's. Now, she had no choice. She was committed. Yet, surprisingly, after Malcolm had thrown her out of her own house, She had come to realize she could walk away from Ian if it came right down to it. And that disturbed her greatly. Had her feelings for Ian been based on nothing more than boredom and sex? Maybe revenge? If so, it wasn't a pleasant thought. In fact, it was downright sickening. What of her children? What did her reasoning and actions say about their existence? Perhaps because he sensed a shift in her behavior, Ian relented a little. "No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's just that it's a sore spot for me and I didn't," began Ian contritely. Ian stopped speaking as he saw Jessica grin, then giggle. "What's so funny?" he asked a little defensively. Jessica burst out into full laughter. The sound was merry and delightful. At least it would have been to her husband at one time. But to Ian, it was a bray that sounded abrasive and crass, even forced. It made him sick, and he hated her even more, with a burning passion. "Sore spot? Your leg? Sore?" gasped out Jessica between fits of laughter. "Huh." Panting heavily, with tears running down her face from the laughter, Jessica caught her breath while explaining to Ian what she'd meant. The tension of a moment ago was gone, and she felt relieved. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have laughed, but it struck me as funny. Your leg, I'm sure it gets sore after a while, and you saying it was a sore spot, like your Johnny. I don't know, it was just funny," Jessica said, smiling wanly. Ian chortled, albeit, obviously, insincerely. "Yeah, I get it. Put that way, I guess it is funny. I'm sorry, honey, I wasn't making fun of you. But I do want to have fun with you," Jessica said teasingly, adding a mischievous smile at the end as she suggestively swayed her hips while sashaying slowly to Ian's bedroom. Sighing at the memory, Jessica carried her plate and glass to the table, then sat to eat. Chewing slowly, Jessica thought back on how she'd gotten to the point she was at. Had she meant to leave Malcolm one day? Was that it all along? She wasn't sure. She'd been very happy with Malcolm for most of their life together, so it wasn't anything that Malcolm had done to her personally. Although she knew what she'd done was cheating and more, at the time she begun her tryst with Ian, she'd felt guilt at how he'd nearly died at her husband's hands. Ian had repeatedly pointed out how unjust it all was. Malcolm had been protected from the law through the influence of her parents and their friends, so he would never have to pay for his crime. At first, Jessica had disagreed, as she knew what she'd nearly done was considered inexcusable, and that Ian was as much to blame as she was. Essentially, although Malcolm had taken his anger to extreme, he was only protecting what he thought was sacred to him and her family. However, over time, with continued assaults on Jessica's beliefs, Ian slowly but surely began to change her mind, until she relented and continued where Ian and her been so rudely interrupted that day in the woods. She never meant to have another man's children, but despite her precautions with birth control, she'd ended up pregnant by Ian. Ian quickly pointed out that even with the best of birth control, his impregnating her must mean that they were meant to be together. Although Ian's explanation seemed a bit contrived, she went along with it, if nothing else but to assuage her conscience of the guilt that sometimes nearly overwhelmed her. There was never any discussion about her leaving Malcolm, until one day just a couple of years ago, Ian asked if she'd be interested in making their relationship more permanent and legal. Since then, Ian had pestered her nearly every time they met as to when she was going to leave Malcolm. At first, she'd been surprised and somewhat shocked at the intensity of Ian's insistence, but as time passed, the idea seemed less and less remote to her. It was the same as what happened over the years, from time to time. When Ian would ask her not to have sex with Malcolm for a couple of weeks. When she asked why, his explanation was the same, that he wanted Jessica to come to his bed fresh and without being sullied by another man. It made him feel he was as important to her as her husband. Jessica obliged him. Then, not long ago, Ian demanded she not have sex with Malcolm ever again, that his jealousy had grown too great to entertain such intimate thoughts about her and Malcolm. Again, Jessica obediently did as ordered. Everything had been working out as Ian said it would. Part of that plan was to keep their affair quite until Jessica had left Malcolm and divorced him, then publicly announced their nuptials. Then Claire came to town. Now that the cat was out of the bag, the announcement was a moot point. Something bothered her, though. As Jessica thought back, she realized that Ian had made himself scarce while Claire was in town. When Jessica asked him about that, he brushed her off, without supplying any real answer. Later, several days after Claire had left, Ian explained he'd laid low because Jessica's sister's presence brought back bad memories. Jessica had found that a bit odd, since it was Claire and his friend that had saved Ian's life. She'd thought Ian would have greeted Claire with a broad smile and open arms. Although she'd felt the stirrings of doubt at odd times, like now, with this latest oddity, Jessica's suspicions were on the rise, being fueled by all the questions she'd posed to Ian over the years that yet remained unanswered. The ringing of her phone broke off her thoughts. It was Ian. "Hello, Ian. I was just thinking of you," greeted Jessica, a bit coolly. "Oh, is that a bad thing?" asked Ian, kiddingly, chuckling a bit. Ignoring the question, Jessica asked, "How's your day going?" "Wonderful. How's yours?" replied Ian. "I've had better," said Jessica as she tried stifling a yawn and failing. "You sound upset. Are you okay? Has Malcolm done something?" asked Ian, feigning concern. "No, I'm just tired." "Okay, honey. I won't keep you long. I was calling to ask if you and the kids would come by my place tomorrow. It's Saturday and..." Stopping as if to carefully consider his next words, Ian began again. "Since he knows about us, I think it's high time we stopped hiding in the shadows. For that, I can thank Claire. I mean that sincerely. She did me a favor for both of us. What do you think? Are we on for tomorrow?" He had to play it easy and not push too hard, for he knew, since her sister had come to town, Jessica had grown increasingly distant and could just as easily bolt. There was nothing but silence for a handful of seconds. Then, "I don't know, Ian. I'm still of the mind to wait a bit longer. Maybe, until the divorce is final." Surprised at her hesitant and lackluster response, since Ian thought she would be swayed by his news, he replied, "That could be up to a year away. What are we supposed to do? Ignore each other until then?" "I don't know, Ian. I used to know what I was doing. Now, I'm not so sure." "What does that mean?" asked Ian, somewhat angry at her reluctance, but curious despite his emotional detachment from the woman. Sighing sadly, Jessica said softly, "Nothing. Never mind. I've made my own bed. Now I've got to lie in it. So it doesn't matter." Forcefully setting aside her regret, Jessica asked, "What about this Saturday?" Mentally shrugging over Jessica's languid behavior, Ian thought, "Soon I'll be rid of this frustrating whore. She's become increasingly difficult to manipulate and more prone to whimsical behavior. I might be losing control over her. No matter, I've nearly completed what I've started. One more day and it's done." "Oh, yes, Saturday. Well, I thought you could come over and bring the kids. We'll announce our nuptials, if to no one else, then at least to them." "What? No, we aren't going to say anything about any wedding. We don't need my children to come, because I'm not going to tell them anything. Neither are you." Angered even further by Jessica's outright refusal, Ian replied, "Yes, you are. For one thing, they're mine too." Growing even more frustrated at her outright refusal, Ian said, unable to check his anger, "Here's the deal, Jessica. Either you bring them over, and together we'll explain the situation, or else I'll contact them directly and explain a few select things to them. Your choice." Jessica heard his tone. It was cold and unyielding. She instantly knew Ian would do what he just said, what he promised. She'd experienced Ian's various moods throughout the years they'd been together. However, this was a new aspect of Ian, one she'd never encountered, at least not to its fullest extent. Until now, with the rapidly mounting tension, her lunch was threatening to return. "I mean, I've something special planned for you. It's a celebration of, well, us, all of us," continued Ian, relentlessly. "But we can do it another way. I can and will explain to the kids just who their real father is. So, we either announce our nuptials, or I announce something else. Either way, it's going to be entertaining." Jessica knew she was cornered. She couldn't see a way out of the situation. With a sense of dread, she gave in, resigning herself to what was to come. "All right, damn you. I'll be there." "And what of the kids?" prompted Ian, in a voice leached of compassion. Sighing, Jessica said, "I'll try to get them there. They have their own schedules and..." Ian interrupted her, and in a brittle voice said, "I don't care how you do it. Make sure they're here tomorrow. Understand me?" "Yes," Jessica replied softly, in a defeated tone of voice. "Speak up. I didn't hear you," demanded Ian, in a voice heavy with emotion. "Yes. I said yes." "That's my girl," exclaimed Ian, cheerfully, his glee readily apparent in his tone. "Soon. It'll all be over, my dearest Jessica. Then we can each get on with our lives. Such as they may be after the bomb drops," thought Ian, with a silent maniacal laugh. He waited for Jessica to respond, knowing she was broken, but nevertheless enjoyed her squirming, like a worm on a fish hook. Anything else that might go forward from this wouldn't be including Jessica or her brats. They were all a means to an end, and that end was clearly in sight. Ian had planned carefully. Malcolm Harris would pay the ultimate price for his sins. Instead of replying to Ian's remark, Jessica quietly disconnected the call. Ian was incensed. How dare she hang up on me? Perhaps her will wasn't as crushed as he believed. No matter, Ian thought, tomorrow everyone would pay. Jessica felt trapped in a way she hadn't ever felt. Despite that her own actions had brought this about, she still held resentment toward Malcolm. It wasn't logical, yet, somehow, someway, Jessica believed that Malcolm was to blame for part of her situation. If he hadn't tried to kill Ian, then none of this would have happened. She wouldn't have felt an overwhelming guilt, a guilt whose path eventually led to Ian's bed, and to greater intimacies, which in turn brought her to her current situation. She knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to bring her children in on this. Regardless of what she told Ian, there was no way she was asking her children to show up tomorrow. This was between her and Ian, and no one else. Well, maybe one other person. But she wasn't going to tell Malcolm, who she'd been screwing all these years. Trembling at her audacity, she decided that she would write down some things. Malcolm awoke suddenly. His eyes popped open as his mind tried to focus. Sitting up from the bed, he checked his alarm, seeing the time. It was 6:45 a.m. Saturday morning. Mal had planned to sleep a little later, but something had awoken him, and he still hadn't placed what that might be. Could it have been an unusual sound? Perhaps someone in the house? One of the kids? But since waking, he hadn't heard anything unusual. Shaking his head in perplexity, he thought of going back to sleep, but he was now fully awake, so he might as well get up and begin his day. After completing the 3 S's, Malcolm went down to the kitchen, contemplating what to prepare for breakfast. First thing on the list was coffee. Second thing was what to eat. Cereal? No, the thought of eating something cold seemed to upset his stomach. Maybe an omelet? Yeah, that sounded good. Some toast, too, with a heavy helping of butter on each slice. He heard his stomach grumble agreement. So, off-key, but a cheerful whistle, he began preparing his breakfast. He was washing the dishes when his house phone rang. He ignored it as it was still fairly early for a Saturday, and he didn't feel like talking to anyone just yet. He was enjoying the quiet of his morning. Then a few seconds after the ringing stopped, the cell phone went off, laying on the table. Irritated by the 2 consecutive interruptions, Malcolm said, to no one in particular, "God damn it, can't I have a moment's peace?" He ignored the cell phone, too, waiting for its insistent digital ringing to stop. It eventually did, but no sooner had the ringtone stopped, it rang again. Slamming down the pot he'd been scrubbing and drying his calloused hands with the abrupt quick motion, Malcolm retrieved his cell phone and looked to see who was calling. It wasn't a name, but a long-distance number he didn't recognize. He had decided not to answer, but as he held the phone, he changed his mind. With a vicious swipe, he accepted the call. "What? Malcolm? Is that you?" The female voice seemed familiar, but Malcolm couldn't immediately place it. "Yes. Who is this?" The voice sounded breathless as they spoke. "Malcolm, this is Claire. Please don't hang up. Something's wrong with Jessica." "Claire? What the hell?" Malcolm thought to himself as he mentally digested her words. "How did you get my cell phone number?" demanded Malcolm. "Never mind that. Jessica is in some sort of trouble. She emailed me," began Claire, speaking rapidly. "What makes you think I give a shit about that bitch? She's not my problem anymore," said Malcolm with some vehemence, interrupting his soon-to-be ex-sister-in-law. "Please, Malcolm. It isn't just about Jessica. It involves your kids, too," pleaded Claire. Concern quickly replaced his irritation. "What about Trisha and Jackson?" exploded Malcolm, his voice becoming deeper, harsher. "I'm not sure. Jessica's emailed me, but it rambles a lot. But she did mention them several times, along with Ian's name. She's meeting Ian at his place this morning to settle things. Ian had wanted the kids to attend. The whole thing sounds ominous. I can forward the email and you can read it for yourself," explained Claire in a rush. "I'm really concerned, Mal, otherwise I would have never bothered you." Ignoring Claire's explanation, Malcolm harshly asked, "What time were they meeting and where?" "At 8. I'll text you his address," quickly responded Claire. "I'll send the email too." "Okay, I'm leaving now," grumbled Malcolm as he grabbed his coat and the truck keys. "Thank you, Malcolm. Please hurry. It's nearly 8, cried Claire in desperation. "As soon as we hang up, I'll get a flight out." Hearing the concern in her voice, Malcolm became thoughtful, and one other question came to mind. "Why are you really doing this? Because last I heard, you hated your sister." At first, there was a lengthy silence. Then, almost hesitantly, she slowly spoke. "I did. A long time ago, I hated Jess with an unquenchable passion. That hatred, it was my manna. But Now, I don't. I'm long over harboring any resentment. Stifling a soft laugh, she said, didn't you know? Hate is bad for the soul. And no matter what she's done, she is my sister. We're not close, but she's still my sister. Blood is thicker and all that. Grunting in acknowledgement of his wife's sister's words, Malcolm hung up. A few seconds later, an address came in on his phone. Concentrating on getting there in one piece, Malcolm sped through the streets, thankful for the light, early morning traffic. Jessica arrived at Ian's semi-luxurious apartment just after 8 o'clock in the morning. She was alone. Whatever was on Ian's mind didn't need the kids be around when, no doubt, he would grandstand with some ludicrous homily-like oration. There was Ian's door, plain in its splendor, much like Ian once seemed, Jessica thought. Drawing a deep breath, she placed her hand above the buzzer. However, Jessica didn't push it immediately, as if something stayed her finger, which hovered right above the buzzer button. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you ready for the confrontation that is bound to occur since you don't have the children? Asked Jessica of herself. She knew there was more involved that made her question her resolve, but she wasn't ready to delve deeper into it right now. Shaking her head at her doubt, passing it off as simply discomfort, she pressed the buzzer. She was surprised when the door opened a few seconds later, as Ian usually needed much more time than that just to reach the door, depending on where he was at the time. She was even more surprised, even shocked, when she realized who had opened the door. Her son, Jackson, stood there, with a slightly quizzical look on his face as he waited for her to enter. "Come on, Mom. Come in already," said Jackson with some exasperation. "Wah how?" began Jessica, but couldn't focus her thoughts well enough to form the question she wanted to ask. Jackson gently grabbed her by the upper arm and carefully guided her in. As he did so, the movement helped break the mental thrall that held her. "Jackson, what are you doing here?" Shrugging, Jackson said, "Mr. Wilson called last night, said to meet him and you here, that y'all had something to tell us." Ian, he made a run around her. He knew she wasn't going to get the kids involved. Us? Looking up at her son, close up, Jessica suddenly realized that he did resemble Mal somewhat. Of course, she knew that was impossible. It was her mind playing tricks. Wishful thinking, maybe? Who else is here? You and, almost afraid to ask the question, she was even more fearful of the answer. Bringing his arms up and using both hands to indicate himself, Jackson said, "Just me. Trish had something else to do. And Mr. Wilson is here, of course." Nodding her head, Jessica peeked around the wall of the foyer, and seeing the coast was clear, turned to her son and in an urgent whisper, said, "Leave now, Jackson." Seeing the look of stubbornness that was beginning to fill his face only made her more desperate. "Don't argue. Please, Jackson, just leave. Right now." Confused at his mother's unusual behavior, her son stared at her face. "What's going on, Mom? Why are you whispering?" Before she could reply, a voice broke in, saying, "Ah, there you are, Jess. I'm glad you came, although I'm a tad disappointed that Trisha couldn't make it. But that's how the cookie crumbles sometimes." Chuckling at his own lame humor, Ian Wilson turned around and limped back into the main room. "Come in, everyone have a seat. Refreshments are on the serving cart. Help yourselves. I don't stand on much ceremony at home." Jackson moved away from his mom and headed to the cart to see if it held anything he liked. "Jackson," called out Jessica curtly, "go on home." Ian quickly interceded. "What's the matter, Jess? You don't want him to know the truth?" Jackson had stopped and turned toward his mother on hearing how short she was in calling out his name, then faced Ian Wilson in bafflement when he asked his questions. Turning back to his mom, Jackson, with a confused look, asked, "What are you talking about? Go home? What truth?" Before Jessica could respond, Ian said, with a brittle glee, "Why, my dear boy, your mother wanted you to leave and go home because she didn't want you to know who your real father is." Huh. Frowning, Jackson glanced at Ian, then looked to his mother. "What's he talking about, Mom?" "Go home, Jackson. We'll talk about it later." When Jessica saw his reluctance, she added, "I promise, I'll explain everything. But not now. Go home, and I'll meet you there in a little while." "No, we do it right now," shouted Wilson. Taking a deep breath, he continued, "He stays right here. Jackson is old enough to know the lay of the land." Calmer, but with an angry bitterness that he took no pains to hide, he finished with, "And he's going to know the awful truth about his mom." Surprised at Ian's emotional outburst, Jessica was caught off guard by the unexpected shift in behavior. Nonplussed, She wasn't able to offer a rejoinder. Jackson, on the other hand, was quick to catch on and was not so easily cowed by Ian's anger. "Hey, don't talk to my mom that way," said Jackson in a firm and steady voice. His handsome face set sternly in its seriousness, and his brown eyes were cold with unspoken resolve. "Oh, just how should I speak to your mother, Jackson? For that matter, why should I even speak to her, when what I have to tell you, although it involved her, she is no longer a part of? At best, your mother was just a breeding machine. At worst, she is no better than a hooker. But maybe I'm being too harsh on hookers. At least they're honest about what they are." Jessica gasped as she heard Ian's hurtful declaration. A hooker? She wasn't a hooker. Why would he say that? Ian loved her. Over the years, he declared his love for her many times. And she loved Ian. Didn't she? Didn't he? Lost in her introspective thoughts, Jessica failed to see her son moving toward Ian and missed the low growl Jackson emitted as he began a rush. "Stop, boy!" yelled Ian, as he quickly backed up, while moving his right hand behind his back, producing a revolver. "Stop, or I'll shoot you." "Ian, what are you doing? He's our son," screamed Jessica, as she took notice of Ian's hateful words and the pistol he was holding on Jackson. "He's not my son. I don't have a son. He has my genetic material, but that's all. So don't play that shit on me, you bitch." Jackson had come to a halt when he saw the pistol pointed at him. But instead of being fearful, he only felt his anger grow, especially when Wilson called his mom a hooker. But, you said," began Jessica, her thoughts awhirl, as she tried to make sense of what was transpiring. At his mother's sputtering, Jackson turned his body to face his mom, keeping Ian within his peripheral vision and using his body as a shield, momentarily fumbling blindly with something on his belt. Jackson hoped his actions had gone unnoticed by the man holding the gun. "Forget what I said. You stupid bitch. I just used you. Yes, that's right. Used you. To get back at that son of a bitch husband of yours. I played you like a fiddle from the very first time." Ian cackled maddeningly. "How could I love a woman that breaks her word to forego all others? You were so easy. I thought I would have to really work at it. But no, you caved after a few weeks." "What? You played me? All these years?" asked Jessica wonderingly, stunned beyond belief at this revelation. "Yes, I did," laughed Ian, manically. "If Malcolm had just taken it like a man and let me screw you all those years ago, it would have been over back then. But he had to act the pissed-off hero." Ian seemed to lose it then, screaming profanities at Jessica. "You filthy scum-sucker. You never loved me?" asked Jessica in a quavering voice. "Wow, you have a thick skull. Haven't you been listening?" taunted Ian. "Of course, I never loved you. You were a means to an end, a tool. How could I love a tool? The fact is, I loathe you." Silence greeted his last statement. Jessica was horrified at his words. She was even appalled at her actions with Ian through the years. She'd given him children at his insistence, because she thought and believed that he had loved her. But none of that compared to the upwelling emotions of hopelessness and sorrow she felt when it hit her just how deeply she'd betrayed her husband, and all for nothing. Nothing but some twisted sense of revenge for something that had happened so long ago. Grief-stricken, she let out a mournful wail at all that could have been, and now would never be. "Yes, now you know how I've felt all these painful, despicable years," said Ian with a joyless cheer. "I planned on telling all of you. How I used you, Jessica. How you denied Malcolm of his progeny. How all of you were going to go through the rest of life knowing just how much a bitch and 304 you are." Laughing softly, but malevolently, Ian waved the gun haphazardly, at no one in particular. "I want the world to know just how much your vows mean to you, that you, a married woman, would bed any man, and bear his children." Goaded by his own vitriolic spew, Ian continued his rancid oration more animatedly. "Mostly, I want to see the look on that a-hole's face when he learns the complete truth, to see the hopelessness of his failures, to know it is my blood that courses through his children's veins, that it was my seed that created them in his bitch's womb, to let the world know that I cucked the mighty Malcolm for decades. I want to see him rage in fury at his helplessness." Ian's ringing laughter echoed eerily in the large apartment. That's when Jessica noticed in passing that much of the furniture was missing. She could see into the bedroom and saw that it seemed to be bare of the furnishings that she'd grown accustomed to. You've noticed the missing furniture. How astute of you, bitch," exclaimed Ian, mockingly. "I've given the furniture to charity. I'm sure they'll make good use of it. My deeds are done here, so I'm moving on. You despicable little man. A little man that walks like a freshly screwed prostitute, only with a pig as diminutive as the rest of you. A gimpy limp tiny willy. Jessica had finally found her voice, winding up as her fear of Ian and his pistol, taking a back seat to her rising anger. Just so you know, I faked every organism, since I couldn't ever tell if you were in or not. Ian, surprised at Jessica's verbal attack, stood disbelieving for a moment, but quickly gathered his wits. Why you bitch? I'll, shouted Ian, but never got the chance to complete his words, as Jackson surged unexpectedly forward with a blood-curdling yell. Lunging, the young man reached Ian at the same time as Ian pulled his arm up and fired. The sharp report echoed off the walls in the nearly empty apartment. The shooter and the young man fell together in a heap, as Jackson's momentum carried him violently into Ian. Following the shot, even as the sound of it was still reverberating in the air, a piercing scream rent the air. Jessica stood transfixed as she gave voice to her horror and fear. She'd forgotten the presence of her son throughout her exchange with Ian. Jackson heard every word she and Ian had said. Somewhere deep within, she felt the slight nudge of mortification, but the pressing concern for her son squelched that feeling as her feet moved forward of their own accord. Jackson! Jackson! Jessica screamed as she ran to her son. His body lay crumpled and motionless atop Ian's prostrate form. Jackson's back was to Jessica, with his face turned away. One leg lay crooked while the other was splayed out. Both of Jackson's arms were under his body. Jessica didn't see any obvious sign of a wound, nor any blood, but she knew. Unlike that shown on TV shows, a body stopped bleeding when the heart quit beating. She wanted to roll Jackson over, but wasn't sure she should. She couldn't remember if that applied to all injuries, or just to some specific injuries. Her mind refused to supply an answer, so praying that she was doing the right thing, she heaved her son onto his back. That's when she saw the blood. It was seeping out from his left shoulder. It isn't gushing, Jessica thought, so that's a good sign. Right. She cudgeled her memory, but couldn't remember what exactly the slow bleeding meant. Instead, she grabbed one of her son's arms and felt for a pulse. Yes, it was there, weak but steady. Somewhat relieved, Jessica began to reach for her cell phone to call 911, when a cruel voice stopped her. Don't even think it, said Ian in a hoarse gasp. Jessica turned to look at Ian, and saw that he had the gun pointed directly at her. He was still laying on the floor, but had raised the arm to bring the pistol to bear. Shit, he can tackle. Let me call 911. Jackson is hurt badly, screeched Jessica in helpless fury. No bitch, you don't call anyone, groaned Ian as he raised himself to a sitting position, all the while keeping a steady aim on his target. What? You're out of your mind. I'm calling 911, declared Jessica with finality. Do that and I'll kill him, then you can watch him die. You'll know, as you draw your last breath, that your child preceded you in death. Take that to the grave. The law will catch you and burn you for our deaths, you scumsucker, said Jessica in voice leached of all emotion. Slowly getting to his feet, Ian cheerfully ranted, I don't think so. Anyway, just so you know, I hadn't planned to kill anyone. My thing was to let you live the remainder of your pathetic lives, with the unchangeable knowledge that you screwed over your husband. Your kids would know that their mother is a 304, and that they're illegitimate, and Malcolm would know as well, but he'd also know that a lifetime was wasted. His lifetime. You think he'd want to start a new family? Have other kids with another woman? Would he even trust another woman? That is, if he found a woman willing to marry him, and that was young enough and willing enough to have children by an old man. Ian Wilson's cold laughter filled the near-vacant apartment, echoing hollowly through each empty room. How could you be so evil? So heartless? I thought you were, cried Jessica in anguish. Screw you, bitch, shouted Ian, his words falling on Jessica like drumbeats. I didn't force you into anything. I didn't tie you up. No, you did it all very willingly. You mislead me, you lied. You deceived me with your bullshit. I believed your lies, said Jessica, ever so calmly. She was past feeling anything anymore. Her only thoughts were to buy as much time as possible. Someone had to have heard the gunshot and called the police. She just had to wait, and help would arrive to save Jackson. All part of my plan, explained Ian more calmly, taking his cue from Jessica's own calm demeanor. At least, until a few minutes ago. I really wasn't going to kill any of you, not even Malcolm. But when opportunity presents itself, well, plans change, said Ian, smugly pleased with himself. What do you mean? Asked Jessica, curious despite herself. I don't understand. If you weren't going to kill us, then why the change of plans? Oh, that. Simply put, when the hero here, Ian nudged Jackson with his foot, and even though unconscious, elicited a painful moan at the movement, charged me, and I shot him. It came to me. I would stage a break-in. You and your son broke into my apartment, we fought. I managed to reach my pistol, and in the ensuing scuffle I shot him and you, as I was in fear for my life. Ingenious, isn't it? Eyes wide in shock, Jessica couldn't believe her ears. To cold-bloodedly kill two people. The concept lay beyond her wildest imagination. She knew it happened all the time, according to the broadcast news, but to hear about the act, to have it spoken about in such an everyday and deliberate manner was beyond horror and terror. It boggled the mind. W-ish, Jessica began, but something had caught in her throat. Clearing her throat of the sudden mucus, Jessica tried again. Why kill us? With a gloating smile, Ian patiently explained. That's the ingenious part. Killing you and Hero, here, would leave Malcolm adrift at sea. See, there wouldn't be any accusations or excuses or answers. He won't know why you did it. He'll be eaten up by his own thoughts and doubts as he wonders why. At least, he won't find out from you. Also, he won't be able to rid himself of the anger and madness for all the hurt you brought on him. For obvious reasons. Relishing his new role, Ian Wilson proceeded to explain further. Jackson, well, I'm sure Malcolm has come to love the boy, despite the fact that he's not the father, so killing him would leave Malcolm even more desultory. Not even a fake son to carry on his name. Naturally, just the presence of the daughter would constantly remind Malcolm of his loss. So, I'll let her live. Yes, Malcolm will suffer, and there is nothing he can do about it. Nothing. Jessica stood there, her hands clenching uselessly, aghast at Ian, as he spoke, the words coming off his tongue seemingly sounding rooted in a foreign language. Shaking her head with incredulity, she said, You can't do such a thing. It's murder. They'll find out. Maybe, but I'm willing to bet the cops won't ever have a clue. After all, it'll be my word against, oh yes, 2 dead people. Laughing uproariously, Ian stepped back and took careful aim at Jackson's still form. Now it's time. No more talking. Wait, screamed Jessica, leaping off the floor to launch herself at Ian. Looking up at the same time as Jessica made her move, Ian swung around quickly to bring his pistol to bear on the enraged woman hurling at him. She was a perfect target, well within sight range of the pistol he held. He couldn't miss. Unlike her son, who was zigzagging, he had taken a snapshot and got lucky, but it had been close. He really didn't have time to aim with the woman, but Jessica was perfectly lined up. With a squeeze of the trigger, the gun went off, and he imagined seeing the bullet leave the barrel and hitting Jessica dead center of body mass. Her face held surprise, and that look people get when they lose. Jessica fell boneless to the floor, skidding a few inches before coming to an abrupt stop. She lay face down with her body twisted into a grotesque pose. She wasn't moving, and as far as Ian could tell, she wasn't even breathing. But, to be sure, he put a round into the woman's head, at point-blank range. Jessica's head shattered. That was messy, Ian thought. Note to self, no more close-up headshots inside apartments. I wanted you to watch your son's demise, but you just had to be first, spoke Ian to the corpse of the woman who he'd once physically used for sex and revenge. You just couldn't wait. Turning back to the boy, he was about to aim when there was a loud tearing and snapping sound, and his apartment seemed to shake. Before Ian could turn to face whatever it was, he heard a loud bang, louder than his own pistol, and felt someone punch him in the chest. There wasn't any pain, but he seemed to be having trouble breathing. Ian looked around, and for some reason he was laying on the floor, looking up. However, his vision seemed blurry. Although he heard voices speaking, he couldn't make head or tails of what they said. Then a loud buzzing began and the sound grew so loud that Ian tried to cover his ears. But his arms and hands didn't seem to work. Oh well, he was so sleepy. He needed a nap. He hadn't realized how tiring shooting people truly was. With a gurgling sound, Ian entered a deep darkness, where he knew a peaceful rest awaited him. Malcolm had gotten to the condominium in good time, even if he'd bent the speed law a little. Being that it was Saturday morning, most of the building's residents were still at home, meaning he had to find parking. He'd spent at least 5 minutes driving around until he found an empty slot. In approaching the main entrance, he noticed that the glass front doors were magnetically secured and access was granted by a keycard. You either had to be a resident or the guest of a resident, to enter. Furthermore, facing the entrance, there was a horseshoe-shaped security desk planted right in the middle of the building's main lobby, with a seemingly alert security guard sitting behind the desk. Malcolm knew of 2 people who lived in this building, but he wasn't sure that they'd let him in without question. Getting the guard's attention, Malcolm rapidly spoke through the speaker just to the side of the door, explaining his need to enter the building. Although the guard listened to Malcolm's story, he refused to let him in. However, as luck would have it, as Malcolm stood outside contemplating how he would get inside, while the overly large security guard eyed him suspiciously, a tenant stepped out one of the lobby's elevators. And it was one of the 2 people Malcolm knew who lived in the building. As the tenant exited the building, Malcolm engaged him in conversation.